We are tonight inaugurating an adventure facilitated by the generosity of the Leverhulme Trust, which was awarded to Centre Cath, the School of Fine Art, History of Art and Cultural Studies at the University of Leeds in conjunction with the University of Huddersfield. And it provides us with an opportunity to bring to our campuses and our extended communities of scholars, artists, citizens of the region and indeed of this country, the director of Documenta 13, Carolyn Christov Bakargiev. She will be with us over the next 7 months until June 2014. For some of us, this inspires terrifying awe. As not only was she the director of one of the most influential and highly regarded documenters of recent years, but she was voted, here she's welcoming you, she was voted the most influential person in the art world in 2012, so quake upon your boots for that, as a result of what she'd accomplished in conceiving and realizing Documenta 12. Now, in writing this up, Art Review reminded us that there are two opposing camps battling it out for the domination of the international contemporary art world. On the one hand, the huge globalized art dealerships catering to the international super-rich, those individuals so dazzlingly wealthy as to be immune to the economic crisis. The definition of being wealthy is that you live off the interest of the interest of the interest of your wealth. Right? And on the other, which is what we're really concerned, a vision of art that is politically engaged, historically aware, and socially inclusive. This was at least the story, according to Art Review magazine, whose annual list of the 100 most important figures in contemporary art, the Art Power List 100, placed the first woman to be accorded this honor, the Italian and US-based curator Carolyn Christov Bakargiev. Described by one critic as the most important exhibition to date of the 21st century, Christov Bakargiev's Documenta was seen as setting a fresh agenda for artists, audiences, and curators. As you know, Documenta is an event that takes over an entire city castle, combined new work by artists including Tacita Dean and Ryan Gander with the relics of destroyed Bamiyan Buddhas and anti-Nazi tapestries from the 1930s, and even, as it says here, even, which of course is to miss the whole point, experiments devised by the physics department of the University of Vienna. I'm sure all of you are aware that Documenta is a quinquennial international art exhibition founded in 1955 to reconnect the post-totalitarian Germany to the democratic international world of art, culture and thought after the traumatic interruption created by the Third Reich, which had outlawed modernist art in the same terms as it sought to eradicate 2 of its cultural and ethnic minorities through industrial genocide. Located in a town which is freighted with its own history of the Third Reich, Reichenau was one of the concentration camps, as well as a glorious cultural past of the first, as holding the first European Museum of the Enlightenment, the Friedrichianum, which is used. And here you have one of the artists who should be Horst, I'm sorry, I'm such a dyslexic, sometimes I miss out letters anyway, dealing with the kind of question of Castellan's memory, which was part of Documenta. But Documenta has become the post-war focus for the art world, mapping not only art's history, but allowing us to think about art as an index of the complex geopolitical and economic reconfigurations of our increasingly globalized world. What a huge responsibility to carry is being the director of such a prestigious, visited and critically placed exhibition as event, as mirror, as index, as laboratory, as experiment, as site for the production of many knowledges about art and through art. Each director has shaped a project involving exhibition, education, and theoretical cultural reflection. Carolyn Christov Bakargiev, as the director of Documenta 13, is going to share the results of her process, the 4-year process through which Documenta was created. And it is an unusual one because she established a series of priorities around definition and experience of art in relation to other forms of research, in relation to our current understanding of our place in a world which includes non-human species and non-human things, as we'll discover, and the question of our joint survival, forms of non-standard knowledge, the nature of witness and presence in a digital age explored through the specificity of art. issues of time and embodiment in the experience of the exhibition as a social and cultural form of encounter and critical engagement with the challenging issues of our contemporary societies in rapid transition. Our project here aims at an in-depth exploration of the process, the event, and the afterlife of a major cultural practice as both an event in time and space and a critical experience whose cultural memory we may be part of fashioning in order to enrich and challenge fine art practice, art history, curatorial studies as they are in British universities today. Over the next few months, Carolyn Christov Bakargiev will give 2 further Leverhulme lectures, work with students at several universities and colleges, work with museums and art institutions, and challenge our thinking in a series of 2-day intensive seminars, which I have strangely called institutes, in honour of my dear friend Vera Frankel. These are open to all interested people, and what you have before you is the timetable of the 3 Leverhulme lectures and institutes in case you want to sign up already. An in-house seminar will run to keep us up to speed with this astonishing thinker and doer and her practice. Our aim today is to participate and foster the critical thinking about art and the critical thinking performed by art, even beyond the limits created for it by increasing commercialization and dealer domination of world artistic production distribution. You might be interested to know that the winner of Art Review's Power List for 2013 was Her Excellency Sheikha Al-Mahassa bin Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, chairperson of the Board of Trustees of the Qatar Museums Authority. Although she is only 30 years old and a long way from being a household name, she has been named the most powerful person in art. Indeed, the editor of Art Review, Mark Rapoltz, said that the numbers spoke for themselves in terms of her, quote, sheer buying power and what that means for the market. There are no confirmed figures for how much is being spent or what is being bought, but it has been conservatively estimated at 600 million a year over the last 8 years, building up the Qatari Museums Authority. There are 2 ways in which the looking contemporary art sector in 2013, says Mark Rapoport. One sees art as an interchangeable, exchangeable commodity, and one is about ideas and aesthetics. As the art market and the art scene generally has globalized, we are seeing a dominance of that sense of art as being something that is exchanged. Perhaps what's happening in these great inflated museum buyings are part of that. However, our project here is asking different questions. Is art to be merely a new industry, a highly financed commodity in the entertainment sector? Can it retain its critical function in terms of exploring, refracting, and reimagining? How can the imaginative and the sensorial find a place in digital information society? How can art be a form of research, and what forms of academic and academically enriched professional practice can disseminate that research and expand understanding of the role of the imaginative theoretical in confronting challenging issues facing contemporary societies? How do we justify the importance of art in relation to the key transformations of human life and its socio-technological conditions? How does its practice sustain emancipatory energies confronting continuing crises of security and long-term sustainability on a multi-species planet? Grasping the challenges we face globally, politically, ethically, humanly, and post-humanocentrically, working with art as research and with the need for those of us in art to be in touch with the widest research across the many fields of knowledge, politics and thought, Carolyn Christov Bakargiev has demonstrated a practice not determined by the force of money, but by commitment to artists and to art as necessary, critical, playful, imaginative, engaged and transformative. Her lecture tonight will be exploratory of her way of exploding the boundaries of the ways we think, by putting before us a profound and interdisciplinary question: why does matter matter? She will pose this through the usual exhibitionary discussion of the unusual exhibitionary manifesto that she placed in Kassel as the brain of the exhibition. Just hope. And I want to remind you, I'll just go past this because we're moving on. And then, therefore, the lecture she is going to talk to us about is this strange event which contains an artworks, objects, photographs, documents, brought together as the programmatic and oniric space in lieu of a concept. Provisionally held together, the brain does not indicate a history, an archive, but a set of elements that mark contradictory conditions and committed positions of being in and the world, fitting ethics, desire, fear, love, hope, anger, outrage, and sadness, against the conditions of hope, retreat, siege and stage. And even in reading that out, I think it begins to indicate the kind of range of thoughts that we have. So please will you help join me in welcoming Carolyn Christov Bakargiev, who's going to give a lecture on matters of importance, why matter matters, things, strings, here and there, and look into the brain of Documenta 13.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gisela. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful, wonderful presentation of the lecture. Far from the usual presentations that are a list of biographical facts and straight to the questions that we all, I think, are thinking about. So I would like to thank Griselda Pollock personally for inviting me to this project of this year, of being able, which allows me to think together with you about what the Documenta could mean and meant. So it's a great privilege to be able to go through another process, a different process now after the Documenta. And I would also obviously like to acknowledge the Leverhulme Trust for supporting this and my being here. And I look forward to also being in Huddersfield and all of the other places that this project will take us to. Before I start the lecture, I thought of a couple of points in relation to what you said. One was the fact that this year, 2013, there was in this crazy and mad classification of people in art world, this nomination of the Sheikh of Qatar, which on the one hand is of course symptomatic of a shift of the areas of the world where it is authorized to speak. And so on the one hand it is an acknowledgement of what is happening also outside of the Eurocentric locations. But on the other, indeed, it may indicate a complete failure of the Documenta project. So we don't know, but we shall see in the long run, because it is of course a mark of a swing in the opposite direction of the notion of what has impact, I guess, in the imaginary systems and in the real lives of people working in art. So that's one point. And the other was, there came to my mind the question of the artistic role or the artistic practice within this universe of that marketization and financialization of art that you refer to, which we know has been going on for centuries and centuries. I mean, this is, of course, also about committenza and the relationships between art and power throughout history. But there is something very unique and particular to our period, which needs to be very clear in the minds of young artists, I think, beginning their work today, which is that in the age of so-called cognitive capitalism or knowledge-based economy, in many ways, as Paulo Virno described the subject of multitude, the subject of the 21st century must be flexible, precarious, and homeless, able to move around the world very easily in a suitcase, must not have like a grounded family, because that, of course, creates less consumption. I mean, it's better to have 2 washing machines rather than 1, or 4 rather than 1. And so it breaks up those small nuclear families, and it also calls for this precarious subject and flexible laborer who must also be able to reinvent him or herself constantly, be creative. So in many ways, the artist is, I believe, for the emergent power, the avant-garde of the alienated laborer of the 21st century. So we are both teaching or learning to be artists at the time when this particular activity is at the crux of the problem. But at the same crux of the problem as was, for example, the worker in the beginning of the industrial age. So the power to make political changes is in the hand. It didn't mean that there were no farmers in the 1800s, but the political agency lies in the hands of those who are at the crux of the matter. And therefore, artistic practice is both extremely dangerous in its celebration of creativity and also full of potentialities of reimagining the world and changing the stories that we tell each other so that other stories can be told from those stories. And I think that's the biggest question I always ask in my work is, what stories do we tell each other? What stories do we want to tell each other so that other stories can be told? Today, I will not speak in particular about the worldly, the notion of the worldly and worlding, which will be the topic of the second Leverhulme lecture. And therefore, I will not speak in any particular way of questions of multi-species coevolution and how we might think together about what art is amongst the humans and what other practices, creative practices, are amongst other species, and in order to imagine a broader, make it broader than what we have been looking at up to now in art history and in artistic practice among humans. That will not be the subject of this evening, but it is more, but as Griselda mentioned it, I wanted to mention that it will be the subject of the second lecture more than this one. Today, I would like to take to zoom even further back, actually. Further in, on the one hand, into the brain, which is a very small area of the whole exhibition, which was located in the Rotonda of the Friedrichianum. So to zoom into that, but before that, to zoom much further back out than what we call different species and so on, but to look at questions of why matter matters. Things, strings, here and there. Of course, there are word plays here. So the first half of the talk is about, is a more general theoretical framework of my thinking, and the second one will be more specifically related to the brain. And then I would like at the end to save a little bit of time for your questions, which then can be more in depth discussed tomorrow in the Institute. So this evening, I would like to speak about stuff and matter, and why matter matters. This is humus, humus meaning earth, not hummus that you eat, and coming from compost. That's compost bin. And why matter matters. Also, but less, about things, and perhaps even about objects and what they might be. And I would like to evoke a politics and aesthetics of nearness and worldly interactions through form-making and thing-making, at times apparently with others, at times apparently by oneself. This means to think with and through art about how the world is indeed and somehow out there, independent, or rather preceding the I, the subject, the so-called subject, as in a traditionally realist philosophical perspective, yet also about how the sense of self-affection, a more current way of speaking of subjectivity, what used to be called subjecthood, is constantly generated by and through the vital agencies of materials and matters of the world that matter, when we are committed to them. And committed, I remind you, is etymologically to put with, cum mittere, when we are placed and emplaced with them. I will do so with some examples drawn from Documenta 13. The choreography of Documenta 13, which, by the way, was not only in Kassel, as the article written about that question mentioned earlier, but also in other locations around the world, which were conveniently ignored by the media. The choreography of Documenta 13 was intentionally unharmonic and frenetic. The appearing of movements and positions in different places did not suggest that we danced together in a digital utopia of synchronicity. Rather, this non-choreography relied on a spatial turn of displacedness, on a contorted frenetic, contorted interplay of movements in several places, from Kassel to Kabul and Banff in Canada to Egypt, Cairo and Alexandria. They could not ever really be synced. They cannot ever be global. And the participant global, quote unquote, in terms of the myth of the global that we are subjected to. And the participants and visitors of Documenta 13, myth of the global that we are subjected to in the sense of global being the globalization of corporations, basically. And the participants and visitors of Documenta 13 were not encouraged to feel that they were everywhere at the same time, simultaneously experiencing life together in a synced manner. Therefore, Documenta was located in an apparent simultaneity of places and times, and against the backdrop of the impact of the internet on how knowledge is produced and circulated in our world, on how we are constituted in an endless construction and reconstruction of the self, on how economy, politics, and society generally have been and continue to be affected and transformed by the digital, contributing to global financial capitalism, the corporate control of life, and the current religion, our current religion called the economy, which lies very far from a deeply needed spirituality that seems to be present in the world today. Over the past 10 to 15 years, a number of devices, PC computers, laptops, cell phones, Blackberries, and iPhones and iPads, have indeed linked people in ways that were previously impossible, building molecular networks and archives where people are both more and more connected and more separated. Experience is increasingly indirect. Access to information is, of course, quicker and quicker. So more and more information needs to become available, hence the obsession with scanning and archiving as much as possible of our past and present lives. In the digital, the past haunts us like never before, a potentially inexhaustible repository of traces of history. To build these archives of everything, more and more people have been put to work, and more collaboratively, in a knowledge-driven economy that functions more and more on the basis of these products of immaterial labor. Cognitive labor produces goods of the intellect, and the control over and ability to use these flows of information determines forms of power, suggesting that the artist, as I mentioned before, is caught between the emancipatory potential of artistic practice, the potential of the imagination, and the fact of being a prototype of the alienated, creative, precarious laborer of the 21st century. At the same time, an infinitely close gaze onto the smallest subatomic particles reveals today in quantum physics a place and moment where reality coincides with information, where the mental and the physical, the subject of observation and the observation are mutually engendering themselves, where people, their thoughts, and the things of the world are all interrelated and create each other in a world that is terrestrial and hardly immaterial. I would like to explore now with you the question of the art exhibition as an embodied and distracted archive. This trahere, this, by the way, is an image of the work by Jeffrey Farmer, the Canadian artist Jeffrey Farmer, in the Neue Galerie during the Documenta 13, which I will speak to you in a few moments about. This trahere, distracted, comes from this and trahere, so to pull or to draw in another direction. So I would like to think about the art exhibition as an embodied and distracted archive, the files of which, to return to the etymology of the English word file, in the French word fil, from which it derives, a fil is a string, are strings, lines of flight, and not the documents that originally were hung on the fil, the string, of the proto-archives and archives of our past. A string is not an abstract line, a series of connected points on a plane. A string is an embodied, thin, woven connecting device with which string games can be played with your hands. Or you can use strings to tie things together, to knot things together. And I remind you of Donna Haraway in her text commissioned for the Documenta series 100 Notes, 100 Thoughts, called Speculative Fabulation and String Figures. Speaking of Navajo cat's cradle figures or string games, writes, quote, "These string figures are thinking as well as making practices, pedagogical practices, and cosmological performances. Some Navajo thinkers describe string figures as one index, as one indication of patterning for restoring hoso, a term imperfectly translated into English as harmony or beauty or the right relations of the world, including the right relations of humans and non-humans." The word string also evokes the current string theory in physics, which developed first in the 1960s in an attempt to study nuclear forces and was abandoned, and then redeveloped in the 1980s to describe quantum gravity, and since the 1990s has been subsumed by the more current notion of the 11-dimensional M theory, or theory of everything. In string theory, point-like particles are replaced by one-dimensional objects called strings. Strings are found on a subatomic quantum scale. They oscillate and they can change. Now, I don't really know what strings are in physics because I'm an amateur, but they make me think of musical strings, of vibrations, of multiple universes that are in existence simultaneously, which is why the physicists also chose that word to describe point-like particles that are no longer point-like particles, but one-dimensional objects they called strings. So the stories we tell each other go in various directions through the various fields of knowledge. These are the storytellings of science, stories that are grounded in our times and also that shape and create our times. This is a closer look at the Jeffrey Farmer piece that I thought could introduce the images of artworks to this lecture. Now, this work is called Leaves of Grass. Well, not this work. This is a flat picture on a screen off the computer. But this image is an image of a detail of a work called Leaves of Grass, of course referencing Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. The work consists of hundreds of shadow puppets, actually many more than hundreds. I see thousands perhaps of shadow puppets that have been fabricated from photographs cut out from Life magazine, the classic American illustrated news magazine. They are drawn from 5 decades of the journal's existence, from 1935 to 1985, when millions of Americans relied on Life magazine for their view of the world. And Farmer repurposed this obsolete news format, making use of a collection of magazines that were given to him via the manually intensive technique of cutout and photomontage. As his title suggests, both time, the photographic archive of the 20th century, and space, the three-dimensional sculptural activation of collage, are volatilized in this work. So he cut up the images and reintroduced the two-dimensional into this overarching history that he retold. So it's a personal history of the 20th century, focusing on particular things that he felt were needed to be focused on. The moment when the Kodak Instamatic came in, the moment when color, printed color photographs and color television comes in, and so on. So the history that he draws through this composting of the shards of Life magazine is the work that he wanted to embed into the Documenta as somewhat of a metaphor for the entire project in his way of reading what we were trying to do together. The interesting thing about Why Matter Matters and this very archaic paper that was cut into these small puppets on on little stilts, was that it, of course, went against all the conservationists of the museum, because it was positioned in a gallery where, although there is UV filtered glass, one side of this long history was paler and paler throughout the 100 days of the documenta, while the other side was perfectly in the colors as they were when he picked up the magazines. Therefore, reinforcing the fact that actually matter does matter in many ways. And it also matters in the digital age, but we are told that it doesn't. Although we lose so much, there is, first of all, a problem of digital trash, and then there's a problem of obsolescence of software, and so the inability and possibility of accessing unless one is able and has the power to write the programs of software that can then translate obsolete programs into programs that can read those files. So that will direct what of the late 20th century and what of the 21st century will be part of the knowledge and the archives of the period. In 1968, which was one of the years, of course, that this chronology, that this history, that this disobedient chronology told. In 1968, the German sociologist, philosopher of aesthetics and musicologist Theodor Adorno, who died in 1969, known by all of us ever since the 30s, well, not directly by us ever since the 30s, but known ever since the 30s for his praise of the artistic autonomous avant-garde based on critical theory and self-criticism, negative dialectic, criticality, and the critique of modern consumerism and its culture industry, wrote, however, he wrote it in 1969, published in 1970 in his book Aesthetic Theory, quote, "It is self-evident that nothing concerning art is self-evident anymore. Not its inner life, not its relation to the world, not even its right to exist. Art must turn against itself in opposition to its own concept and thus become uncertain of itself right into its innermost fiber. Because art is what it has become, because art is always what it has become, its concept refers to what it does not contain, to what it no longer contains. The tension between what motivates art and art's past circumscribes the so-called questions of aesthetic constitution. And indeed, the tension between what motivates art and art's past was actually the tension of Documenta 13 and the tension that lies behind the wanting, the caring for art, the wanting to be with art, and yet the questioning whether the field of art can even exist today or should exist ethically, because of the fact that we now understand that it is based on an ethnocentric a priori, which is the Western modern definition of what art is, and which has been, of course, globalized. But because we understand that it is so contingent and dependent on that a priori, the question arises of whether one can actually operate in that field. So how does one move from theology to an anthropology of art? Or let's say, how does one move from theology, from within the field, accepting the a priori of that field, to a study of religion? Wow, that should be the end of the first part of this talk, but it isn't. It's just the beginning of the first part of the talk. But we have plenty of time, so I think we will go on with the first part of the talk. Adorno's position was politically radical, yet fundamentally skeptical, and that's what I share. And in fact, I know that this aggravates a lot of people, but I think I am an Adornian. And yet I am steeped as well in the materialities and in the nearness of things. I am a Baradian and a Harawayan, to mention Karen Barad and Donna Haraway, which seem to be at the antipodes of an Adornian perspective. And it is sad to note that so few intellectuals in the field of art know the ideas and situated philosophical studies of feminist science studies practitioners like Barad and Haraway, which I find essential to today's thinking. On the one hand, and that has something to do with the way that feminist thinkers or women thinking is often somehow arrives late. So we know some things through Deleuze, although Deleuze wrote them after many other things were written by other people. But that's another subject, the question of Deleuze and the polemic and the celebration of certain aspects of Deleuze's thinking, and also the polemic that I have and with Deleuze. But we will get to that in the Institute tomorrow. So on the one hand, the tension between what Adorno called the freedom of the particular, that is, the freedom in artistic practice and in the artwork, vis-a-vis the, quote, unfreedom of the whole that Adorno spoke about, the society, the environment, the politics, the family, history, the unfreedom of the whole, the fundamental aporia that he pointed out in his aesthetics theory, and on the other, the tension towards de-anthropocentrization, what some people call post-humanism, but I don't like posts in general. The de-anthropocentrization of art and human culture, how to move away from human exceptionalism, from this a priori that everything rotates around the human and that the world was created to serve the human, which is the only a priori which continues after religion gave way to modern philosophy. The only thing in continuity between St. Augustine and modern philosophy is human exceptionalism, which is why ethology is kept, the study of non-human behaviors are kept outside of the field of pure philosophy, in the field of zoology or ethology. These two poles, one focused on the dialectics between art and non-art in society, the other focused on the holistic embracing of the generative entanglements and multiplicities of becoming and becoming with, bracket and motivate my practice as a curator over the last 30 years, and in particular, the Documenta 13. This is a mind map of the Documenta that I wrote down in my office in 2009, so many years before it opened. And it is quite interesting that most of what was here actually came to occur years later, although I obviously forgot this mind map and forgot it, and yet things came back. The question of Breitenau Castle, Kabul Castle, the Boetti and the One Hotel, on the one hand, the red, on the other hand, some of the themes that I was thinking about that emerged from being situated in Kassel, from being in the heart of the production of military armaments for the Nazi regime, and yet also in one of the few exhibitions which somehow belongs to the artists left in the world, and perhaps one of the most wonderful things that the 20th century created for art. Some things did not occur. For example, somewhere on there is the large glass, and also Hamilton. Hamilton did not enter into the Documenta, and the large glass was not borrowed, nor did I request to borrow it. But somehow the large glass was fundamental to the concept of the Documenta, and indeed it became the glass of the brain that you saw before entering into the brain, that we shall look at in a short while in ways that we can discuss. So now there are a certain number of topics that I'd like to go into more precisely before the second part of the talk. One is I would like to mention worlding. Two is I would like to look at new materialisms versus speculative realism and the so-called object-based ontologies of today. And then After that, I would like to look at consider for a moment things. What are things? Or how we can think about things. And finally, touching. What is touching and how we can think about touching. And then I would like to go inside the brain. So let's go for it. So, worlding. Now, many of the artists I hope to mention over the next lectures and today cross a research, empirical, and material-based practice with storytelling. And the work's core lies somewhere in the space and the time of persons and personas engaged with worlding, not in the objects of art per se, not in the artworks per se, nor in the subject of language and the discursive, but in the space of thinking and in the space of enchantment, magic, singing, seeing beyond the surface of things at their agencies, beyond and independently from culture and art, to which they and the artworks bear witness. And the way that I use the word worlding it comes from Donna Haraway and not from Heidegger's Weltmachen, which means worlding. Haraway's use of the word worlding was inspired by mathematician and ecologist George Evelyn Hutchinson's notion of niche spaces, where worlding is, quote, activity along every imaginable dimension of an ecology of the world. And Haraway writes, Hutchinson nourished worlding, an SF discipline, if ever there was one. SF means science fiction, or speculative fabulation, or special feminism, or anything else you want it to mean. She continues, poor in world, Heidegger's worlding is a barely distant kin. For Haraway and for me, worlding is the encouraging of the coming into the world of things and entities that were not there before. Not a repetition, but a flourishing. And it is associated with the notion of the worldly, which suggests the world as bigger and beyond the human's view of the world. And we use it in contrast with words such as international, global, transnational, or even cosmopolitan. Although cosmopolitan is the term that Isabel Stengers uses when she coins cosmopolitics, and it is the closest, perhaps, to the worldly and worlding. It associates with things like terra and Gaia, terra being the earth, the planet, and Gaia. Heidegger is a distant kin because it is still based, because although contrary to Donna Haraway, I find Heidegger very interesting in many ways. And I think that what he did is very important shift, which was the shift that then also brought to Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology, and therefore to the body, and to the importance of the embodied experience of the world. And so it is a poor world because it is still based on the notion of a self and a subject, which is knowing the world. So the first, and it is still this self, like Merleau-Ponty's self, which is touching the world. But nonetheless, even though it is a poor world, it is an embodied world. It is a world of touching. And Heidegger, when he first used the term in 1927, he spoke of worlding as being the way we experience a world as familiar, so the way that we experience the world as near us. Worlding is a determination of Dasein's being, wherein the world belongs to Dasein's existential constitution. Worlding offers measurable standards of being, and worlding is a constructivist process of the thinking world. So he uses worlding connected with being, caring, clearing, gathering, nearing, to bring near, lighting, opening, presencing, reckoning, thinging. Authenticity, intentionality, mortality, potentiality, reality, spatiality, the everydayness, fallenness, throwenness, ready to hand and present at hand. So this worlding of the world in Heidegger, I think, still needs to be referenced as a very important moment of responsiveness to the things of the world, as opposed, and in contrast with the old Descartesian division of mind and body. Which was, of course, the same division of mind and body that lies behind classical Newtonian science. The idea that there could be this external observer knowing the world and measuring the world. Now, I'd like you to bear in mind this image of a Klein bottle. Now, to explain this image, it is the quotient space described as the square with sides identified by the relations, which I'm not going to read. Okay, now, we don't really understand, but we sort of understand. But we will talk about this Klein bottle for a minute. The Klein bottle was first described in 1882 by the German mathematician Felix Klein. But actually what you see is not a Klein bottle. It is, of course, a two-dimensional flat representation of the Klein bottle immersed in a three-dimensional space, which of course is not on the screen. In mathematics, the Klein bottle is an example of a non-orientable surface. Informally, it is a surface, so a two-dimensional manifold, in which the notions of left and right cannot be consistently defined. Other, for example, to understand related non-orientable objects include the Möbius strip and the real projective plane. But whereas the Möbius strip is a surface that has a boundary, so you twist the thing, so the inside and outside are both present, but it has a boundary. The Klein bottle has no boundary. An example of another object that has no boundary is a sphere, orientable surface with no boundary. Now, a Klein bottle is a distracted thing in the sense of distrahere. It is a structure where inside and outside are mutually assuming the position of the other, as an image for a distracted exhibition. Although it speaks to how we can create an interior space, the exhibition, that would create a different exterior which is related to it. Actually, in this 3D Möbius strip, there are three characteristics. A containing entity, so there is an outside. There is also a contained, so there is some sense of an inside. But there is also the dimension of the uncontainable, which is neither the contained nor the containing, neither the outside nor the inside, but the uncontainable. This triad tripartite way of looking at this form recalls the artist and eco-activist Paul Ryan, who has been working since the 1970s, and to whom in the Documenta 13 I dedicated a participation by inviting him to organize workshops of his healing practice called threeing. And it was located in one of the over 20 small wooden pavilions in houses that were dispersed throughout the Aue Park. Perhaps the second most important venue after the Fridericianum in the castle part of the exhibition. Ryan had been one of the first artists involved in video usage, not as a news media or normal communication, but as a radical software, as opposed to using it for the publicity or normal television. In fact, there was a group and publication called Radical Software that he was very involved in. He had met Marshall McLuhan, and he had worked actually for Gregory Bateson, a thinker at the basis of all our relational aesthetics and relational family therapy. Bateson, who was also the husband of Margaret Mead, by the way, in a certain period, and they had a daughter. Bateson had inherited from the founder of American pragmatism, Charles Peirce, in the late 1800s and early 20th century, Peirce's notion from the late 1800s and early 20th century of predicaments, a theory of predication in language which speaks of firstness, secondness, and thirdness, where firstness is about making a statement. I want to drink from this bottle. Secondness is the reaction. Well, here it is. And thirdness is the not doing. It's the position of the non-reaction. And what Paul Ryan created and has created over the last 30 years, 40 years, and again in Documenta, was workshops to learn to perform and practice threeing. And threeing consists in a group of people switching positions and practicing the different positions. First being in the firstness, then in the secondness, then in the thirdness, and switching these positions as a kind of relational therapy exercise in being together. In some ways, it was an active exercise to practice the craft of being together in the way that Richard Sennett might speak of together. And it was about mobilizing these positions. Documenta 13 was an art exhibition, but it was also a process of threeing in many ways, and a state of mind. It certainly was a distracted exhibition, somewhat of a Klein bottle, where artworks were contained, and they were drawing outward into the world, literally and figuratively. Objects functioned in relation to the experience of witnessing, the artist's witnessing of the world, the viewer's witnessing of the artwork, and even the art object's witnessing of the spectacle within which it is caught and entrapped today, as in the sculpture with the beehive withdrawn and witnessing in Pierre Huyghe's Untilled, or many other works in the Documenta. So now, in it, the notion of archive, of the archival, was viewed with suspicion and pulled, distracted, towards forms of symbiotic decomposition and recomposition, somewhat of a cultural quasi-compost. So I would like to move from the archive fever to the compost fever, literally and figuratively. Now let's look for a moment at these materials that we are made of and that we share the world with. This is just to have a pretty picture, is prokaryote cells, early cells. So, matter. So, stuff. For me, the word stuff gives a sense of indistinct materiality, made up of elements and things that exist as an agglomeration of potentialities. Stuff is a repository of things we might need or use at a later date, or it is the baggage of past things we carry with ourselves and that increases along the way during our lives. It is the physis of the world, both made up of matter which has not coalesced through our consciousness into being a set of things, objects yet, and also a heap of those things without function or purpose, but that once were objects. Matter, etymologically, well, not even etymologically, mater in Latin means the hard core of wood with which we build things. So it is the basic material. It is wood. The hardest part of the wood. And the expression matter of fact only appears late. And then, even later, more recently in modernity, comes the subject matter, and thus somehow the opposite of the original meaning of matter. Not by chance, also, the word matter and the word mother are related. Mater is both the piece of wood in Latin, and it is also the mother, that with which we build, indicating material itself as the generative of the things of the world that we make. Matter is life because it is the matrix of things. Now, in a recent email, a young artist and student of mine, because now I'm teaching, so a student of mine, called Andrew Yang, a marvelous artist, wrote to me and explained things to me. He wrote to me, he's a student of art who was trained as a scientist and as a biologist. So to earn a living, he teaches science at the Art Institute of Chicago, but in his free time, he studies to be an artist. And he wrote to me in an email, "As for the question of form, there is no specific form I'm thinking about, but rather trying to think about how it can be a unifying concept for the multifarious form things I am interested in, from ecological webs to tiny crystals, imagined shapes in others' minds to string figures on my fingers, and. Carolyn, a Haraway quote is useful in this regard, and I think sums up the spirit nicely." And then he quotes from Dana's book, Crystals, Fields, and Fabrics of 2004. Quote, "Form, like nature, is one of the most complicated words in the English language. Form is about shape, number, figure, beauty, making, ritual, image, order, cause, relationship, kind, conduct, and character. To have good form describes a way of doing something that is at once about ethics, techniques, and practice. It appears today that a number of thinkers, both in philosophy and in science studies and cultural studies, are looking at the materiality of the world with renewed Spinozian interest. As if a swing were taking place away, moving us away from constructivism, the world is there because I think it, and from the discursive, the whole trajectory that took us to Derrida and beyond, towards realism. The world is there independently of me. I actually feel that it is about time that we make some distinctions between the new materialisms and related cosmopolitics versus the speculative realism and object-based philosophy. It is the liveliness and the refusal to see a subject-world divide in the new materialisms that brings me towards them, and relatively far from the object-based philosophers. It is the importance of maintaining the we and the awareness of the constant transformations and interactions of matter that move me away from what I see dangerously as a potential fetishization of things and objects amongst some philosophers. I see no conflict, indeed, between the fact of being able to sense a thing and the awareness that the thing is made up of a multiplicity of interacting elements. Since its inception, Western thought has been structured by a series of gendered dichotomies, such as nature, culture, mind, body, male, female, object, subject, rational, emotional, human, non-human, fact, fiction, etc. While postmodernism has critiqued modern claims of an objective access to the natural world through classical science and issued these dichotomies by putting into relation real material is constituted by telling us that real material is constituted by language, in a move away from such dichotomies, feminist new materialisms suggest that language and culture do not entirely contain materiality and the real, nor that culture and matter are isolated and separate domains. In her book, Psychosomatic Feminism and the Neurological Body, published in 2004, Elizabeth Wilson, for example, argues that psychic and somatic forces are co-constitutive. She also argues that biology and psychology are co-implicated in evolution. This goes against entrenched mind-body dualisms as she looks again at the biological relations with the psyche through Freud's early writings on the lamprey fish's nervous system. So she goes to Freud before psychoanalysis. And in When Species Meet, Donna Haraway argues there are always only nature cultures. There only are nature cultures. That is, material semiotic entanglements of life forms and species, mind and matter that co-evolve through interwoven situated histories of kinships, politics, economies, and environments. All bodies are fully enmeshed communities of bodies, as she reminds us that most of the DNA in our bodies is not even human DNA, anyway, to start with. But that of the many organisms that are our companions, messmates, kumpanis, such as the innumerable bacteria, etc., and the multitude of species that crowd our bodies, and that we would die without, we wouldn't be able to digest our dinner tonight. And biologist Lynn Margulis's definition of evolution, a very important shift Lynn Margulis made. I think, in fact, the main problem is not between Darwinians and non-Darwinians. The main problem is within, obviously, Darwinian evolutionary thinking to understand how evolution did not occur primarily through competition and the survival of the species, of the fittest, but through the collaboration and sharing of entities that are sentient beings reacting to an environment and deciding to collaborate and creating new chimeras, which for Darwin are accidents, but for Lynn Margulis are the main way in which evolution occurs. She calls this endosymbiosis. She unfortunately died in 2011, too soon for me to invite her to write a document, a notebook. The production of chimeras through the encounter of different sentient beings. She defines a living being as one with a consciousness of its own inside and its ability to relate to its environment, because we are also in the middle of trying to make new definitions of what life is, because the old ones are a bit useless now that we can create life according to the old definitions in 10 seconds in a science lab. She speaks in her writings of physico-chemical bases of our inner feeling of sensitivity and awareness. And the most elementary life form is the prokaryotic cell, bacteria, and how they sense their environment is extraordinary. They have sensitivity in forms of consciousness, and they react. So in early cell evolution, two life forms merge like chimeras, the eubacteria and the archaeabacteria, to form swimming protoctists 1.2 million years ago and to become the earliest nucleated cell. So in many ways, we are all superorganisms, not just the bees and the ants. We are all alliances. We are all many. Therefore, while there may seem to be some connections between object-based philosophy and feminist theory around materialism today, I am not sure how to use the first, but I do understand the latter a little bit. I suspect that the first lies in the tradition of Western philosophy, and in that tradition, which I just mentioned a moment ago, between constructivism and realism, by adopting what is basically a renewed realist perspective. Quentin Messayou, one of the most prominent of the speculative realists, suggests in his critique of the philosophy of the 20th century, discursive philosophy, he criticizes subject-based knowledge, which he calls correlationism. All philosophy after Kant is correlationism for him. And he has contentions with all post-Kantian subjectivism, including Deleuze and Derrida. This is problematic insofar as there seems to be a rejection of the we, not in favor of an it, as if that would solve the problem. He writes in After Finitude, to argue for his point, he writes, the thesis we are defending is twofold. On the one hand, we acknowledge that the sensible only exists as a subject's relation to the world. But on the other hand, we maintain that the mathematizable properties of the object are exempt from the constraint of such a relation, and that they are effectively in the object in the way in which I conceive them, whether I am in relation with this object or not. And he proves this by saying, well, he speaks of the fact that while secondary qualities of objects can only exist if the subject perceiving them exists, the primary quality of objects exists independently from subjects, and thus we must be realist, because the universe, and this is how he proves it, predates the human species by millions of years. quote, empirical science is today capable of producing statements about events anterior to the advent of life as well as consciousness. These statements consist in the dating of objects that are sometimes older than any form of life on the planet. But the problem is, in my view, that Mesailloux, I believe, is still thinking within the frame of a body-mind divide. And thus he sees human consciousness in the problem of correlationism. But if the mind-body divide were not acknowledged, as in quantum theory, then the problem that the existence of the planet or the universe predates the human is senseless, because the universe is still made of sentient beings from the smallest subatomic entities that are both wave and particle at the same time, mutually engendering the world. This is not a human prerequisite to be a sentient being. Entanglements and interactions are beyond the human. Furthermore, the problem of object-based philosophy is that as it has become an emergent and dominant currency in philosophy that does not work, it does not work against, this is the political problem with it, it does not work against the popular culture of our consumer society today, but rather in line with it. As consumers are more and more prone to anxiety in the virtual world, digital world of the internet and the global, they feel more and more suspended from the knowledges of the so-called local and the so-called material knowledges. And as a consequence, their needs for grounding are translated by a new consumer culture into the commodification of prehistory of objects. For example, the provenance of objects on the packaging, that we know where the eggs come from will sell the eggs more easily. The traceability of what we buy becomes part of the of capitalism. The commodification of history and of histories, the fact that we are grounded within this past material culture, in fact, the fetishization of the archive, the commodification of difference and differences itself and themselves. So this makes the space, this is why I disagree that Documenta 13 was somehow a version in art of the turn towards object-based philosophy, which was written also about it. I find that not correct, not right. Not what I wanted to do, at least. This makes the space of art objects and of exhibitions, both spaces of suspension and emancipation from the flow of goods, images, information, and disembodied communication, as well as spaces of potential further alienation, unfortunately, subjugation and anxiety. Unless one performs, which is why there are millions of people going to Tate Modern every day, unless one performs acts of self-criticism and negative dialectics while one is an artist, a curator, a member of the audience, understanding the provisional nature of all matter, materiality, and things within an entangled space-time of condensation and dissolution, continuous acts of making matter matter while seeing it tremble vertiginously on the edge, a recombining into other stuff of the world. In fact, contrary to speculative realism, feminist speculative fabulation is both science studies and science fiction, embodied knowledges that are both animate and inanimate, and are forms of knowing with, produced by the encounters and frictions of different materialities, agencies, intentionalities, intra-actions rather than interactions, as Karen Barad uses the term intra-actions. So rather than interactions of pre-existing entities, two things exist and they interact, the coming together that engenders the existence of those two things that come into the world through their intra-actions. Language is not a semiotic system projected by the mind onto the world, but is the stuff itself of the world. The world is language. A language is a verb. Life is a verb. It's in and of the world and of its guts. So I wanted to mention for a moment this world that's made of coming together and transforming. And I was going to speak to you about, but I'll go a little bit over it rather quickly. But I wanted to speak to you a little bit about things. And in this speaking about things, it is important to me to suggest the question of dirt or dust that then can become clay, that then can coalesce into an object, or pottery that then can fall and shatter, that then can become dust again. Or it can last for thousands of years. So the provisionality and this constant transformation of the materials and is one way of looking at how matter matters, how it matters itself, together with people, for example, when we fire a pot or when we put it on a wheel, but also without people, for example, the way that clay is made of particular particles that become very impermeable through sedimentation. It's sedimentary earth that then gets collected by water in erosion into certain pools and spaces. So in the brain, that hopefully we'll get to, which is located in the back of this building that was looking like this in 1943, after the October bombings of the center of the city. It's important to know that we know that there was a Nazi regime, obviously. We know that Kassel was the heart of the military building of tanks and so on for the Nazis. We know that that's why it was a target for the bombings of Harry the Bomber. However, and we know that the Nazis burnt the books in front of the Friedrichshainum of this building that was a library at the time, the same library where the Brothers Grimm worked in the early 1800s. So we know all of these things, but we also know that the bombings hit the center of town, the most densely populated and the poor neighborhoods where the workers worked. And there were no bombings of the factories, nor of the wealthy neighborhoods. And because the Friedrichshainum is in the center of town, very near the neighborhoods where the workers lived, the factories were stopped by the death of the workers, but they were working again 6 months after the end of the war, and they still are churning out tanks, which we find today in Afghanistan, for example. So what Luther did not burn, and what the Nazis did not burn, Harry the Bomber burned in terms of the German Middle Ages, which were in that building, the incredible collection of German Middle Ages, and very few books, a certain number of books survived. So books were another kind of undercurrent of the Documenta. Now, we go to this question of things. So, one of the few texts of philosophy that addresses a ceramic object, as we all know, is, I think, I mean, as I learned, is actually Heidegger again. His text called The Thing is a text which was a lecture originally delivered at an art university, just like this one, at the Bayerische Akademie der Schönsten Kunst in Munich in 1950. And he discusses in that, trying to discuss what a thing is, he discusses a jug made by a potter. The first thing he does to discuss what a thing is the fact that modern technology, airplanes, telephones, and so on, has shortened distances, apparently, television and so on, commercial air travel. It has abolished a certain remoteness, and it has created a uniform distancelessness, which he contrasts with nearness. And he identifies a thing with nearness. If we read that now, we see that we are just a more extreme situation of that same description of the abolition of distance through technology that was already well underway in the by the mid-20th century. Then he speaks about the jug, a thing, and he says that it is not in the object itself, that it is itself. It is not in the vessel, and it is not in the fact that a potter made it, that it is itself. But its thingness is in its ability to hold and its inability to pour. So it's a holding device of liquid, and it is a pouring device. So a thing is thinging. And he criticizes science. And he says that science destroys the thing because a scientist would say that the jug is not empty, but it's full of stuff that's in the air. So that by putting a liquid in the jug, we are simply substituting one matter with another matter. And he says that this is outrageously useless, and therefore we shouldn't think in terms of the way science thinks. But the blind spot, I find, there are two blind spots in the text. The blind spot of evoking the potter and then liquidating the potter in an instant troubles me. He mentions it's a handcrafted jug, and by 1950 he could easily have avoided the problem by speaking of a jug that was produced industrially. But he brings the potter into the question, and then he sends the potter away. He removes the body of the maker of the jug. The other blind spot in the text is the dust. He mentions the dust, or the small invisible particles that the scientist would say are in the empty jug, the so-called empty jug, and liquidates this. And then he brings in the dust again as the dust of the atomic bomb. He speaks almost from the voice of a subconscious fear of the dust, a fear of these small invisible particles that cannot be held by the mind in a mind-body divide, associating the atomic dust with dust, and therefore also ignores completely the materiality with which the jug is made by the potter, the unfired clay. In fact, he says, when we pour wine into the jug, the air that already fills the jug is simply displaced by a liquid. Considered scientifically, to fill a jug means to exchange one filling for another. Science's knowledge, which is compelling within its own sphere, already had annihilated things as things long before the atomic bomb exploded. The thingness of the thing remains concealed, forgotten. The jug is a thing insofar as it things. So he does understand that a thing is a verb, but he is troubled by the possible dissolution and transformation of the materiality of the thing, which brings me to touching. He doesn't address the question of touching the jug, of what it means to actually hold the jug and put the liquid into it, and what it means to be in that state of touching, what it is to touch matter, the way that it is in the touching that matter comes to matter. It is in the touching matter that shaping occurs, that we create the form and we make the vessel. When dust rises, we usually intend a situation of confusion and lack of clarity. And while organic compost makes an earth in which things can grow, dust is the fine, tiny atmospheric particles of ground, earth, and rocks that seems arid and unable to produce the lively and the vital. And in fact, in Italian, alzare la polvere means to create a veil of distraction, to use the word again, distraction, and to create problems so that one cannot arrive at the solution of a situation or form of truth. So in this sense, somehow dust is the infraordinary of Georges Perec, not the object, not the thing, but it is that which envelops us and of which we are made. Not the center of experience, but the thick materiality that matters in matter, the densification of atmosphere. So when dust is heavy with water, it may be clay, itself also the object of weathering and decomposition. It is elastic. Clay is very elastic. So I told you that I would like to speak about the coming together and the dissolution of matter. And I would like to speak about the objects and things and the brain. The brain contained many ceramics. Ceramics is one of the most ancient crafts on the planet. Once humans discovered that clay could be dug up and formed into objects by first mixing with water and then firing, we are speaking about animal and human figurines as far back as 24,000 BC. It's amazing. And even 10,000 years ago, when settled communities were established, tiles were manufactured in Mesopotamia. And the first functional pottery vessels for storing water and food must be around that time or shortly thereafter, and as well as clay bricks, so the vessels that contain our bodies for sleeping and being protected from the rain. So it is in this cycle of matter and how matter matters, the sense of precariousness and provisionality of things that can be destroyed and dissolved and come together, that is the holding position that somehow was the brain. Because in my view, there need not be any choice between constructivism and realism. They are actually both true. We are both inside ourselves, and there is an exteriority. But these are correlated, like in the Klein bottle that I showed you, or the three-dimensional Möbius strip, where the inside and the outside are inside and outside simultaneously. Now, I would like to mention Karen Barad, who is a quantum physicist and also a philosopher that I learned so much from. And it is in her writings that it is made most manifest and clear to me that matter exists only in mattering and that life is a verb. It appears undefined, but Barad suggests things and us are undefined until we mutually define each other, the potter and the pot. Now, in her essay on touching, Karen Barad first speaks about the notion of touching in classical physics. And in classical physics, touching is none other than a form of resisting. It is a form of not touching, because it is a resistance to entering into a relation. It's basically a rejection. And this is because electrons cannot go near each other, but they will go far from each other. So electrons will not touch each other. And if we could actually touch the jug, our hand would go through the jug. But because we cannot touch it, we can actually hold the jug. But from her perspective, which is the quantum physics perspective, which she looks at as well, I quote her, she explores the act of touching as it takes place in physical matter, in theorizing, and in the productive spaces where the two are indistinguishable. On the human scale, electrons trouble the notion of touch by making it impossible to close the distance between atoms. The sense of touch paradoxically relies on electric repulsion between neighboring objects. But on the subatomic scale, each electron gleans its energy from touching itself as if undergoing an exchange with another. Not only does the presence of contact come from its absence, but also the presence of electrons themselves relies on a void holding their virtual counterparts. On every level, one can never reach the other, even the other within oneself. The paradox on the microscale that constitutes all macroscale matter calls into question the spatial and temporal fixity of identity. Barad shows that the notion of a unified autonomous self is problematic, not just on the personal level, but on the particle level as well. And she responds to this deconstruction of matter with an ethics of responsibility. Now, I would like to get to the brain at this point. So I'd like to discuss some of the artworks and materials contained in the so-called brain section of Documenta 13, which was a dense aggregation, and keeping all of what we said in the background, which was a dense aggregation of artworks and things in the rotunda of the Fridericianum, acting in lieu, as Griselda said, of a concept of the exhibition. It was a composite one that eschewed any simple or clear reading as well as any form of digitalization. You couldn't email the brain to people. So in this way, it was a little bit like a hieroglyph or a rebus of objects and things that could not be transferred in a press release or in any other way than walking into that place. Ironically referencing the fashion of neuroscience today, this brain was not a CEO. It was not a center or war room from which orders were given, but instead a core of multidirectional irradiating elements and forces and potentialities that were touched and illuminated by a number of embodied elements and artworks outside the brain. In the field of the exhibition in Kassel, Breitenau, Kabul, Cairo, Alexandria, and Banff, as much as it acted agentially as the core of a distracted exhibition, pulling the audience out of the brain in many directions. There is no brain, in fact. The psyche and the soma are interacting, and our brain is in our foot as much as it is on our skin or in our stomachs. The brain is a containing. It has an outside, there is the glass, and an inside. And it also has a neither, a sort of thirdness, like a Klein bottle, that somehow represents the brain. It doesn't look like the space that you as visitors were in, although it has curves, as did the space of the brain. And there are tensions between the inside and the outside, and the neither inside nor outside. In the catalogue of the project, I wrote that behind a breeze made by Ryan Gander and the voice of Cécile Floyer, the rotunda was sealed off by glass. It was an oniric and programmatic space in lieu of a concept. And I wrote all the questions that, the points that Griselda already read, so I will skip them. Pitting ethics, desire, fear, love, hope, anger, outrage, and sadness against conditions of hope, retreat, siege, and stage. Amongst the most ancient objects in the brain were a series of Bactrian princesses that date 2500 BC to 1500 BC. They come from Western Central Asia. These are composite stone figures that are made of dark green or gray chlorite or steatite. The female ones are actually, with heads of white limestone. And at times, in some cases, they have a little bit of lapis lazuli elements that come from the same area of Afghanistan. All lapis lazuli of the world, I think, comes from there. The head, the body, or the arms and the feet of these tiny figures, some slotted loosely together without glue or any means, are sometimes also still present. Now, only thanks to the commitment and care over thousands of years of holding these parts in a precarious togetherness do they still exist today, and could you see them in the brain. They are the size of smartphones and other technical devices. Although they decline for us not the digital, but the grounded nature of embodied life, as well as the precariousness of all bodies, including bodies of culture. In fact, there are only 80 of these known sculptures in the world today, whereas there probably were thousands of them. So they both speak to the question of care as to the question of the precariousness and loss of objects. So the brain was apparently it was apparently an exhibition within an exhibition, a miniature thesis exhibition. And I would like to mention something that Judith Barry wrote about the brain. Judith Barry was an artist invited to participate in the Documenta 13, and her work was a guidebook to the brain, which appeared as a kind of kaleidoscopic object in paper that you could put together for yourself. Was a sort of compression of time and space of a guidebook onto one origami piece of paper, folded piece of paper. She writes, in speaking about the brain, when Carolyn Christov Bakargiev told me about the concept for the brain, it immediately triggered an intense visual image. It was as though I had been dropped into an infinite space where all the elements she was describing in the brain were suspended in an array. When I moved through the space of the array, it seemed endless and went on forever. And this is before the brain actually existed. It's in her imagination of the brain through how I described it to her. When I moved through the space, it seemed endless and went on forever. And yet, all of the objects seemed to be in extreme close-up. And I seemed to be in a place where time, too, was suspended, yet visible. In the space around each object, when I came close to one of the objects, I would suddenly be pulled into its orbit, and its many histories came at me from a variety of different trajectories, each made visible as it unfolded. I was intrigued and reminded of a childhood fantasy of being inside time, as though there were an inside and an outside to time itself. The desire is, of course, a fantasy about omnipotence and ultimately is replaced by time as we know it. That said, it is also a fantasy about the potential for another kind of space, a space inside time, a speculative space with antecedents in quantum mechanics and physics, a place where all things can be together all at once within the imagination, inside a moment where time is suspended as if frozen, and the histories surrounding each object are still there. I would say time was suspended, but it was not frozen. It was actually all time at the same time, in the way that the time of each object was there when one was near each of those objects. She speaks about, a little bit later on, what would happen if all time-embodied elements and their histories were suddenly available to us in all of their variety, and what if we could hold each of them discretely in our mind. So all time simultaneous, yet each moment discrete. I think this is correct, what she writes. It is better than how I would describe it. So the brain, to me, had many linkages, inward linkages and outward linkages. It appeared as a rebus, a hieroglyphic text to be deciphered by the gallery visitor. Those are the names of all the artists in the left, and other objects. Not all was art, and these were the positions, so we'll just keep that there. Certainly one way of reading this aggregation or compost of elements, materials, cultural artifacts, contemporary artworks, was to connect each of them with artworks and projects outside the brain, somewhere else in the documenta in Kassel, Kabul, Banff, or Cairo, Alexandria. And I will attempt to do that shortly. But another way was to stay inside the brain, to not be distracted, distrahere, outwards, and to propose a centripetal reading. It is here that it becomes apparent that I made no Hegelian statement, no chronology of artistic events or developments, no history of styles, techniques, as in the traditional Western modernist histories of art. And I would like to remind everybody that I owe things to Griselda Pollock's Virtual Feminist Museum text. Furthermore, if one looks at the postmodern museum, on the other hand, new collection displays that we have seen over the last 20 years, for example, at MoMA or at the Tate or at Pompidou, there was something quite different as well compared to this brain. In fact, there was no attempt in this brain to create an ahistorical and synchronic set of assonances and connections through which viewers could bind together objects that are juxtaposed, as in those new museum displays which abolish history in a way. What occurred in the brain was a matrix, in Italian intreccio, of narratives and specific stories connected with moments of intensity that were connected with my personal experiences and encounters and journeys, both prior to making Documenta and during the years of its making. That is from 2009 to 2012. Certainly, many of these stories touched on recurring tropes, such as the destruction of art, collapse and recovery, the chirological time expressed in moments of social and political uprisings, catastrophe and trauma, loss and retrieval, the moment in which an individual encounters the historical or participates in its making, that is, the personal and the collective together, or, for example, the decision to retreat or withdraw from action as a form of agency, and even more. In this brain, through the use of vitrines, in placement according to a mind map, and a careful use of scale, so that the objects could stand for words or propositions in a series, every object was exhibited with a sense of dignity, or I hope so, and respect for the story that it was pointing or alluding to. The story, it opened up in the viewer's minds, eyes, and brains, activating their memories as well. Because of this autonomy of each object in the brain and each story that this object was referring to, and yet their proximity, the stories became a network of association similar to a neural network in a person's brain. Each story or narrative evoked and alluded to through this synedoki, or this pars pro toto system, became a unit of memory. It was important for me that some of the objects in the brain were artworks and others were not, as a way of breaking away from the specificity of the field of contemporary art, to pull art back to the world of which it is a part and from which it emerges. Those that were not artworks, like the palette knife in the background there, used for the last 30 years by the Lebanese and American poet and painter Etel Adnan, or the glass bottles that Giorgio Morandi used in his studio in Bologna as models for his paintings, and that are today part of his estate, or his books on art history, the book by Faucillon, or a book on the art of Chardin. They were in the brain because they are behind artistic practice, alongside artistic practice, sources for artistic practice, elements of context or consequences of artistic practice. They were not presented, however, as context for the artworks in a typical educational display of a good museum. They were placed on the same plane as the so-called artworks, as elements that shared similar intensities and planes of immanence with art. Such objects had the same intensity as the artworks without being artworks, so that a contamination occurred between the archive and the art exhibition, a contamination able to break open the archive and its powers to authorize and posit the conditions of enunciability itself of statements within a discourse, to use Foucault's 1969 definition of the archive as the structure of power that underlies and instantiates discourses. A contamination that eliminated separate files and folders to allow for processes of symbiosis and cultural composting to occur. This brain of Documenta was not an archive in the sense that Derrida gave to it either. It followed no death drive to collect and conserve objects for some future usage by rendering them inert in the present. If one needs to make any Freudian reference, then I would argue this brain functioned more as a dream would, an embodied dream where linkages are constituted, associations occur, jumps occur, slippages occur, reversals occur, in order to create a fertile compost of clues and matters through which to work through trauma, collective and individual. So if you look here at this puzzle a little bit, amongst the objects and artifacts in the riddle were the Bactrian princesses that I mentioned to you, a small landscape there on the left by Mohammed Youssef Assefi, a painter who in the late 1990s and early 2000s pretended to restore figurative paintings by covering the figures of animals or of humans in the National Gallery of Kabul with watercolor and then putting the paintings back so that he was able to save about 80 paintings from destruction. After 2004, the watercolor was removed and the figures were then visible again, risking putting his body on the line to do this. That was one story. Another story was the small postcards to the right are a part of the project of Tacitadine, postcards representing the city of Kassel prior to the war, early 20th century postcards that she then painted over with white paint to represent what the same location in Kassel looks like today. And the sequence of these 100 postcards were shown in Kabul, in the Documenta in Kabul, not in Kassel, anywhere. The only location where you could find this was this clue positioned in the same vitrine with the Youssef Asefi. So they are both painting over in two different and entangled ways. I'm not going to be able to tell you all the stories because there wouldn't be time, but I'll tell you some of them. So you have the sense of this inward look, and then I'll give you the sense of the outward look from the brain. There was a selection, I think we went through it, of when I showed you the palette knife. There was a selection of artifacts made from metal, ivory, glass, and terracotta from the National Museum in Beirut that had melted together in shell fire during the Civil War between 1975 and 1990, when the museum was on the front line of various factions in downtown Beirut. And of course, Etel Adnan is a Lebanese poet, writer, and painter who then emigrated to Paris. And there are many stories that bring these three objects together that partly you as visitors can put into the story that you hear from me, and partly that I am telling you. The one on the right is from a Byblos excavation. Again in the brain were Lee Miller photographs. Okay, opposite the vitrine that hosted Man Ray's metronome, object of distraction, or indestructible object, because he changed the word. Opposite that, and behind the wall of the Morandi, were photographs by Lee Miller. And they were photographs that she had staged while she was staying in Adolf Hitler's apartment in Prinzregentenstrasse in Munich, when she was an embedded photographer for Vogue magazine, when the American troops entered Munich. And Sherman, who was an embedded photographer for Life magazine, took the photograph. And this was taken the day, it's a very famous photograph that you can read about on the internet as well, but only one of them is famous that you see on the internet, but there are actually a whole series of them that are in the Lee Miller estate. And it shows her dirty boots from being in Dachau in the morning. And her well-known series of photographs in Dachau were those taken while she was wearing these boots that she now is washing her body from the dust, to speak again about the dust. And she carefully staged this with her watch on the chair. So it is again a sort of time suspended, this chirological moment of the entering into Dachau. I also think that she stages this in ways that relate to the large glass, but I have no proof of that. But I think it is a situation where les célibataires have gone above into the top half of the image. And that is why she put Adolf Hitler's press image, which was found in another room in the apartment, on the edge of the bathtub near her. And she also brings in this sculpture by Kasbach that was a part of the rather modest art that Hitler had in his apartment. And her own position is similar to the position of the figure, which is, of course, a trope of sculpture, the woman, and we bought the sculpture that was there on eBay. So the actual sculpture that was in the photograph was also in the brain, in this kind of vertiginous palimpsest of what is an object, what is real and what is not real, and so on and so forth. So there are many, many, many stories here that we will not tell. This is the story of Hochheisel that was mentioned by Griselda. One of the artists that I invited to the Documenta is a Kassel-based artist who had made a public art commission, which was to create an upside-down cavity fountain that was to be, and that is today, in the shape of the positive shape of the Aschrott fountain that had been destroyed by the Nazis. And so this is a celebration to the absent monument. And it is, of course, absurd because you cannot make a shape of a fountain that is so badly shaped because you get things stuck in it. The water doesn't go down well. So because of that, he has a contract with the city of Kassel where every month he goes and cleans the fountain, goes down underground and cleans it. So speaking again about care and so on. There was also this bomb pond by Vandi Ratana, which is a photograph of an apparently idyllic pond in Cambodia, actually shaped by the falling of American bombs in Cambodia during the war against the North Vietnamese, because most of the Vietnamese, Viet Cong, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was going through Cambodia, so there were more bombs on Cambodia than on Vietnam, actually, which also caused the rise of the Khmer Rouge, partly. I mean, we don't know. And next to that is a drawing made by a Viet Cong artist during her time in the war. And now I think time is almost up, so I just am going to give you a few examples of what happens if we look at this same brain. If we look at this same brain, this is question of withdrawal and retreat, Matarese. If we look at this Sam Durant, one drawing by Gustav Metzger prior to his Art of Destruction theorization in the late 50s, this is early 50s, part of hundreds of drawings that Metzger had put away carefully before deciding to then enter into the phase of the Art of Destruction. And they were in a suitcase on top of a house of someone in London until 2010. And in this case, when the suitcase was opened, one of the drawings had been destroyed, paradoxically, not by Gustav wanting it to be destroyed, but by the humidity of being in this suitcase and where the suitcase was kept. So this paradox of wanting to save it and it being destroyed and that wanting to save it brought it into the brain. And now I will tell you something about how it connects to other things. So these were slides of Horacio Larraín-Barros, is an activist artist and fog catcher in the biggest desert and dry area of the world. It speaks to the problem of the corporate control over water and the commons, because he has developed all these systems to catch the water of the fog that comes in the evening, so as to allow for not needing to develop systems of selling bottled water that can be distributed also to other dry areas of the world. This is the famous guidebook that I just mentioned that Judith Barry made of the brain. This is it when it's open up in the brain. Now, if you look at it again, we just, one more minute, look at it again with the connectivities. So this, you can form a vertical axis. As you can see a little bit of the tapestries of Hanna Rigen above. And Hanna Rigen was a Norwegian woman artist who made these tapestries inspired by images on newspapers of events, such as, for example, the conquering of Ethiopia by Mussolini and other things. And these tapestries were put outside the windows as the when the country was allied to the Nazis, when the troops were passing below. So again, a very committed body of an artist putting her body on the line. And because they were women's work, they were not noticed. And it was thought to be just putting rugs out to clean or to get fresh air. A very interesting paradox of history and of time, this collapse of this collapse of different times into one time, is also in the fact that, if you may remember the attack on a public building in Oslo that occurred in 2011 while I was preparing the documenta, one of the works by Hanna Rigen that was going to be in the documenta was destroyed and was therefore not here. But I published it in one of the notebooks, and then it was under restoration by the time the documenta opened. Above, on the level above, was Goshka Machuga's tapestry, half of the work, which brought together a certain number of elements relating to Afghanistan and Kabul. So from the Youssef Asefi painting upwards, you can trace this linkage. This instead is the exhibition of documenta in Kabul. even if you had been 100 days in Kassel and saw everything in Kassel, you would only have a partiality. Documenta 13 was about partialities, the impossibility of owning the world and having all the information. So just to show you here, though, that there was the other half of the Goshka Machuga tapestry that together form the whole in the palace in Kabul. Okay, and this is another trajectory from the brain to the William Kentridge piece in Kassel about the refusal of time and a sort of insubordination against the synchronization of time and the control over time that the digital age is based on. I mean, if we cannot sync our computers, the whole financial system collapses. And so it was about that. Also going out towards the Henri Sala. If we look at this, we have the small prototype of the first binary unit of a computer made by Konrad Zuse, which later became, in the Orangerie, an exploration of Konrad Zuse's world and Erkki Kurianemi's world, which then goes back towards Anton Zellinger, the quantum experiments in the Friedrichiano. From Horacio Larembaro and from Vandiratana's Bomb Pond to the section in the Ottoneum called The Seed, where I planted secretly a little bit of a Möbius strip for obvious reasons, and therefore into The Seed, the work of Amar Kamvar, resisting against the GMO, distribution of GMO seeds and storytelling of different stories, or into the Clare Pentecost composting of with the University of Kassel Bioagricultural Department, proposing the soil erg instead of the gold lingot as a new currency, and making drawings of, and so on and so forth. So, or going outwards from the brain again into the garden made for butterflies as opposed to for humans, with plants that butterflies like. That was a sort of a reversal of the bomb pond, in a way, made by Christina Buch, who was raising butterflies in her apartment throughout the 100 days. And another from the Horst Hochheisel and the, to the actual monthly cleaning, which was part of the Documenta with Horst, or outwards towards the Charlotte Solomon and Anna Bogigian work. From this that you saw before, to the Neue Documenta Halle, to Etel Adnan's paintings, retrospective of her paintings from the late 50s to today. She says that Matisse is in her paintings, and that the trauma of the world is in her novels and poems, and that different languages and materials call for different types of working with art. From the Judith Hopf masks made in the shape of the boxes of iPads and iPods, referring to the mask in the vitrine, which was borrowed from Breitenau, that after being a concentration camp became a girls' reformatory in the 50s, when the city was cleaned up to make way for the Documenta, and there mustn't be the bad girls in the streets of Kassel. So the whole girls' reformatory was set up, not directly linked to the Documenta. It had to do with the society, a repressive society in Germany in the 50s, and a certain continuity of repression going on that continued, as we know, all the way until the early 70s. And actually, Ulrike Meinhof was one of the first people to do news documentaries in favor of closing these reformatories, which were not prisons. No crimes needed to be perpetrated, but simply unsocial behavior caused the internment in what was prior to that concentration camp. So during the art classes, these masks, papier-mâché masks, had been made, and there were 3 or 4 of them in Breitenau that the artist Judy Hopf found and used as an inspiration for her iPad masks, which then takes us to, well, it takes us on the one hand, the bomb puns and the Viet Cong drawing takes us to Dinh Q. Lee's work, which I can discuss tomorrow, which had to do with Viet Cong artists' work during the war, but it also takes us from that mask to Breitenau, the idyllic Breitenau, that on the body of the architecture of the big church there had been violence in the division into cells, and in the dance hall used by the women, young women, Judith Hopf placed another work, which were these very precarious and fragile glasses with no glue. So again, like the Brachtian princesses, the survival of this work is contingent on the fact that it is withdrawn from the visitors. So it was not told in the press or in the guidebook too much. It was told, but in very small print in her page, that there was a work in Breitenau, which has also to do with the protection of the people who currently live in Breitenau, because Breitenau is not only a Gedenkstätte, a memorial museum, but it is also, to the war, to when it was a prison, but it is also currently a psychiatric hospital, which tells us so much about the continuity of repressive institutions. So in order to avoid voyeurism in the lives of the people who live in Breitenau, it changed name. It's called Rucksagen now. There was not focus put on this artwork. So it has, this is connected with the notion of withdrawal and the potentiality that there is for culture in context of withdrawal. I think that that's enough to give you a little bit of a taste of what these lines of flight and these strings going inwards and outwards, and the idea of an inside and outside and a neither of the three that constituted Documenta, or at least what I tried to do with Documenta.